Hello and welcome to a video that I am calling my UVS 2024 campaign platform. Asterisk, I'm not running for anything. Right. Just kind of a funny title because 'tis the season and because it's a decent representation of what this is going to be about. This is kind of a wide-ranging, a rambling, ranting type of video, just covering a bunch of different design-related topics, sort of a what would I do kind of thing. Cringe backseat designing, but these are conversations that happen in Discords and elsewhere and that sort of thing. And I thought it'd be fun to make it a video, just sort of put together, what do I think about sort of all the stuff that's floating around out there and some other pet ideas that are in the back of my head, that kind of thing. This will be strictly design. I don't want to get into power level topics, into things such as how should block mods be balanced, what should zero difficulty foundations look like. That would double the length of a video that's probably already going to be pretty long. So it's not going to be so much about that so much as, more direct design related topics. And we'll get to the table of contents in a little bit here. Just going to do one take. I'm pretty lazy when it comes to this stuff. I'm not going to go and edit this or split it up into a bunch of parts. So if it's not the most cleanest pronunciated or that sort of thing, or there's a lot of pause words, I apologize. But, if I had to do a lot of takes of this, then I probably wouldn't be recording it. So one last disclaimer, like any good campaign platform, because I'm just saying stuff, I get to just say stuff, right? I don't have to have everything perfectly hammered out or finalized, and some things might be changed or discarded or whatever upon further inspection. And like any good campaign platform, these are my thoughts as of October of 2024. So if you ask me in a few months, my positions may have changed. Really a good representation of what we're doing here. So with all that said, the overall topics I want to touch on, first I want to go through some of the AOT 1 design elements, changes, that sort of thing, what I think about them, what I would keep, what I would change, that kind of thing. Then I want to talk about symbols, set structure ideas, what we could do for a draft under, different symbol setups pretty much. Then sort of touch on a bunch of specific mechanics and keywords, some terms, templating stuff. Then a little bit about rules things, kind of getting increasingly more boring as we go on, kind of thing, right? But, so, first things first. Talking about some AOT 1 stuff, and I didn't want to make a slide for every single one of these because it's a pretty long list. Just gonna go straight down here. First of all, forecheck attacks. I believe I would keep forecheck attacks. I think they are a good answer to the question of how do we get people to ever play an 8-diff. That said, I don't think I would do what they seem to be doing, which is kind of creeping the difficulties down, where we're seeing more 6-4s and 5-4s in this second set. I think that's probably a mistake. I don't think you want forecheck theme decks to be a thing. I think if people want to make them a thing, you should make that very painful. Because getting rid of all the variants of having both 5s and 3s in your decks and how that does to your foundation building, all that should come at a price. And so I would stick to at least 7 diff or more with forecheck attacks, and maybe even mostly 8 diffs or more, just so that these forecheck tribal decks aren't, that easy to try to pursue. You probably kind of just don't want them to be a thing, but at the same time, it's nice to be able to print, an 8 diff or a 9 diff attack that's meant to be a late game bomb that actually functions as one with a straight face, and have those in the card pool so that people can decide to put those in their decks. They can have an impact on games. I think it's more interesting to have different varieties of difficulties of attacks being played than to just have everything be 4s and 5s. So I like having them. I would put a little bit more controls on them, but I would ultimately keep them around. Blitz. Blitz I would replace. I appreciate the idea. I like the idea. I think a lot of enhances end up just being these free things that you're always going to push, and obviously the original idea of Blitz was to make it automatic, and then they changed their minds. But I think it's just really wonky. I think for something that's supposed to help new players and make the game easier for them, having an extra timing you have to explain is not the best. And really, they did it the way they did it because they wanted it to be basically an on-play trigger that happened during the attack sequence. And so you have all this convolution here with a new timing keyword that needs reminder text and all of that, just so that they could, fit this, mechanical rules need. And I think you can fix that on the mechanical rules side. You could it is feasible to modify the rules in such a way that is, maybe not the most retro friendly, but you could tweak the rules in such a way that the attack sequence has started after the attack's been played, and any sort of on-play triggers you make would happen during then. And so you could make all these blitz abilities, or at least the ones you want to be mandatory or that are kind of automatic or have a cost or whatever, the timing, whatever you want to do with them, you could make them on-play triggers, and you could come up with a shorthand for on-play trigger that is much more reading the card explains the card. Like, I think specifically you could say on-play dash effect and have that mean that on play you do this effect, or on play comma or something like that. You could shorthand these, make it much more legible, make it much more obvious what's going on, so that person doesn't have to consult reminder text. They don't have to ask people, hey, what does this blitz word mean? So I think the idea of having a timing like this, of having some number of enhances, obviously not all enhances. I don't think every single enhance should be going away on attacks. We already have, stun and powerful multiple and EX and all that anyway. So it's not like you're going to get rid of enhances on attacks. I think there should be room to have enhances on attacks that do other things if there's a sequencing value to them. And there's some gray area. You have to pick which things are really worth it and which ones aren't. I do think most of these abilities should be responses, either add an on-play timing or, add an on-damage timing or that sort of thing. But so first of all, I guess in summary, I'd replace the Blitz ability type with just a regular triggered effect and make the rules work for that. And secondly, I would step back from the sheer dogmatism of we'll never put an enhance on attack ever again. Maybe only 20% of attacks or something like that, but it'd still be around in there sometimes. I think that's fine. Backups are the next thing. Backups, I would at least improve them, if not replace them. I think the way they are right now isn't really teenable. I think having an entire card type that is tethered to this power level tightrope walk, where they need to be strong enough that it's worth having them in your deck despite the downside of your opponent might be able to attack them for a free momentum, etc., and some on-hit triggers and all that. And, it's worth putting them in your deck, even though your opponent, if they really want to, they can just attack it and get rid of it. And so they need to be so good that they're worth all of those downsides, but they have to be not so good that your opponent attacking them becomes a non-decision. If you're going to have this card there that your opponent can attack, you want them to be allowed to decide not to, generally speaking, or else you just make, a stupid HP soak card or something like that, if that's all the backup's going to do. And it's really hard to find that balance. I think Grisha's Attack Titan from set 2 is a pretty good one. I think that one's in a good spot. I don't know if any of the other ones are, and certainly none of the ones in set 1 are. You have the shift attacks, which are, a little hard to evaluate because they're tied to high difficulty attacks and all that. But I think it's just going to be really hard to have a full proper card type over the long term that has to deal with all of that balancing and juggling act, and they're not going to settle into a place where you can make a wide variety of them that all feel appropriate. So for that reason, I don't think the way backups are now is going to be teenable over the long term. I do think it's possible that you could change it to where, for instance, there's a bunch of ways they could change backups mechanics, but let's say that dealing damage to a backup just doesn't count as dealing damage. Right, let's say during the damage step, if you're attacking a backup, instead of dealing damage to the backup, some other set of verbiage or whatever, so that you don't get damage triggers and you don't get momentum, and you ease that a little bit. And if you are sort of fully replacing assets, then you wouldn't have as much pressure to make them better than assets, and you get a little more breathing room there to make backups that have asset-like power levels and have that feel appropriate. I think you could probably get away with that. But you could also replace them, right? That's not the only way to make a different permanent card type. Certainly, I'm not a big fan of assets. I'm not a big fan of actions. We'll talk about that later. I've tossed a pet idea in here, but there's lots of different ways you could do it. But we'll talk about that stuff a little bit later. So overall, backups, either improve them or replace them. Character transformation as a concept, I think I would keep this. I think this is a good place to slot this in when appropriate, for characters where it makes sense. It's a nice way to have some later game power scaling. There's some nice things they can do with it. I like it overall. It's, because they're not in your deck, they're kind of separate from their deck. They don't have difficulties or anything like that. It's not a particularly big burden to flip them and unflip them and all that. So I think they're good. I think they're flavorful. I would keep that idea. Shift, I would probably toss. I'm not fully sold on this. I just don't think having the, flip face up, face down cards in the middle of the deck is really worth it. Some of the ones we've seen set to the ones that turn into foundations are kind of neat, but all in all, I don't think it's adding too much, and having, I know other games do it and people manage the flipping and unflipping, and it's not that big of a deal and people get used to it. But for a game that has complexity concerns, I don't think this is really giving us so much value that it's really worth adding the complexity for it. So I would go ahead and let shift phase out, let it be an attack on Titan only type of thing. Same with outwit. Same thing, right? There are other games that do stuff like this and it's fine and cool, but those other games don't have, those other games aren't worried about their mental load. And boy is outwit not good for that. So, I appreciate it. It's a nice attempt. There's like 1 or 2 outwit cards that I do think are cool, but in terms of making our game approachable for new players, I don't think you want to have that around. On the other side, character rarity. I am / still am a defender of this. I like character rarity. I think the reality of the situation is, though, that, unfortunately, it just doesn't seem to matter. Your secret rare characters are still 30 cents. And if you make characters so rare that they start to have actual value, then you probably have a problem. And so, first of all, if you are going to keep it, maybe you're fine with the fact that, when people actually ask how much this cool character is worth and they hear it's worth 25 cents, if you're fine with that, at least make like the secret rare characters look like secret rares and feel like secret rares, and make them, big main characters of the set that people care about, which is not something that's happened with AOT. The higher, you don't know how rare a character is without looking at the rarity line. You would have no idea. And that's a pretty big miss, and I get, that's comes with having the manga art, and it just is what it is. But if you're going to keep them, try to make the more rare ones feel more rare, but I would probably do away with them mostly for my limited ambitions that we're going to talk about a little bit. The ideas that I have would not work if you had character rarities, so that's kind of where that comes from. But I certainly don't think it's doing very much the way it is right now. They would at the very least need to improve it. But for my purposes for this platform, I would toss it. Characters having no stats, I would keep that. I think character stats is, when we had them, / when people still run into them, it's one of the most commonly asked new player questions is, why does my characters have all these numbers on them? What do you mean I can put a character in my deck? What happens when I put a character in my deck? And you have to explain to them, that's just something that people just very rarely, it's not worth it. Right? It's for something that is, kind of limited to, certain, cute themey decks or really weird odd edge cases. It just let the characters be characters and let them, not be a part of the deck. I think that's fine. I think this is good. I don't think it's, I don't mind losing little niche stuff like that to make the game simpler and more straightforward. Somebody out there is probably a big fan of having characters in their deck, and they're like, oh my god, you're taking my favorite thing away. It's fine. You'll live. At the end of the day, you have to make decisions for, the whole of the current and future player base, and not just, the 3 or 4 people that complain loudly about something. Deciduous mechanics as an idea of having mechanics or keywords that are specific to a given IP, I would keep that. I like this. It obviously depends on how you implement it. I think the deciduous things you do make should be as relatively self-explanatory as you can make them. So maybe not so much outwit, right? But if there was a deciduous mechanic where, the reminder text was very straightforward and easy to understand, or it was just very evocative and you could kind of had an idea of what kind of thing it's doing just by reading it, or like, if you know the IP, you can understand what this mechanic does. I think Ruin is a fine deciduous mechanic, for instance. as something that you can have that's just on Attack on Titan cards, and someone explains to you once, or you read the binder text once of what it does, and you don't have to, your brain doesn't fry thinking about it ever again. So I think this is cool. I think this is a neat idea. I think it's a nice way to differentiate IPs that are going to have enough, a big enough set or enough releases where that makes sense. I don't necessarily want to put some new deciduous mechanic in every single, challenger only release, but in anything we're going to have at least 2 booster sets of for sure, or like a booster plus challengers. I think they make sense. I think they'd be fun to do. So this is something we've already seen them back off of, but in Attack on Titan 1, all of the attack zones are the same as the block zones. Right? Any attack card has the same attack and block zones, and clearly they don't think that's long-term feasible because they've already backed away from it. I agree. I don't think you really get to do that. I appreciate the sentiment. I would be interested in maybe doing that in your Clash decks, and maybe doing that in your commons for different reasons. Just because it is something that sometimes people trip over. You see a new player try to block with a card's attack zone. It is something that you see once in a while, or at least I've seen it. So I don't hate the idea of like doing that in Clash decks, but I think all told, you don't really want or need to make dynamics where if people want to overload a zone, they now have to deal with a bunch of weird block zone math in their deck. I think, hey, just play all the same zone is kind of a nice, accessible early strategy for your new players to take on, to put on their decks, and to have, make them feel like their deck has some kind of a plan, and to punish that by saying, well, now all your block zones is going to be screwy, probably isn't great. It might be interesting to do strictly on commons, or maybe commons and uncommons for like a draft and limited perspective, just so that if somebody wants to draft the zone overload deck, maybe that deserves to be punished. You'd probably have to have more testing of a draft format to determine whether that's the case or not, but that's something I could imagine. So it's an interesting idea. I think I like doing it in Clash decks. I might do it in commons. I wouldn't do it anywhere else. Another thing that we've seen it change with Set 2 already is that Attack on Titan Set 1 really has no direct character support. There are very few cards, if any cards, that you can look at where it's like, oh, this card has Mikasa's face on it, and clearly it works with what Mikasa's mechanics are. And, I can see the connection here, and this card is, this Mikasa card is something that I should put in my Mikasa deck. Obviously, prior to AOT, every set was broken down into this really, really structured, here's a character and their 8 support cards, here's another character and their 8 support cards, here's these very exact 9-card kits with sometimes these little 3-card kits mixed in. And I don't think you have to do that. Right? I think being that dogmatic and super strictly structured about it is something that it's really just a carryover from 2006, right? It's just they kind of started doing this at the start and nobody really changed it. And I think it's something that can be appreciated in terms of keeping symbols equal out within a set. It makes that very easy, but these aren't like real reasons to be doing this. I think characters should have as many support cards as makes sense for that character, pretty much. If it's a big major main character, maybe they have 12. And if it's a really minor character, maybe they get 3, right? And, they don't need to be packaged up and numbered. And we've seen this with Attack on Titan Set 2, right? You can look at cards that have Connie on them or are themed to Connie's story, have effects that make sense to put in your Connie deck. You have this Sasha 1 difficulty sub-theme going on. And this is all good. This is healthy. I think the game, if not needs this, I think it really, really benefits from having this idea that you're going to have these character-driven themes going on within your sets. And then if you're going to have these character sub-themes in your sets, the cards that play into that sub-theme might as well be the ones with that character's face on it, generally speaking, right? And I think that's been a good thing that, given that this game's never had deciduous mechanics, given that this game is, not introduced new keywords, that sort of thing very often, one of the things that's always kept it going from set to set is that in each new set, you have new roster characters, that's a new set of themes, new cool stuff to look for and to try out. And I like that. I think that should continue. I think that's all a good thing. But again, you can be a lot looser with it than they have been in the past, and I haven't gone and counted or anything like that, but my gut feeling is I really like the way Attack on Titan 2 has done this, and I think it should continue to look basically like that going forward. Last thing, the all attuned approach. Every character has 2 symbols, and we're going to have 6 different symbols that we put 1 on each card. Also, this is going to be a slide in and of itself. I would say improve on this a little bit. Namely, I would go to 8 symbols and have 2 characters and 1 on each card. But that's not a super strong feeling. So let's just segue here into symbols and set structure, because this is kind of its own topic. So I'm going to talk about old world versus attuned world. And old world is, by that I mean the classic. We're going to put 3 symbols on every card. There's going to be 3 symbols on your character. You build your deck by picking a symbol and going and finding all the cards with that symbol on it, and that's what you can play in your deck. And sort of that creates a quote-unquote talent tree for different characters, right? You pick your character, and then you have 3 different symbols you can build them off of, and that has some positive impacts. First of all, people who just really like a character now have a few different ways to build them. It's not just, okay, well, your air fire character is just going to play air fire cards, so play the best ones, and maybe you could play into a different sub-theme within that in practice, but it doesn't feel the same as, oh, well, let me try this Deku off of the all symbol, because I've played him a lot off of air, but, I'm not feeling too good about that list. I want to try something new. Let's play my favorite character again, but off a different symbol. So that's beneficial. You also get people that are sort of roguey or budgety deck builders that like to do something that, all the competitive players aren't doing, like, well, I'm going to build my younger Toguro off the alt symbol because everybody's building the death symbol and I want to feel different or whatever. And, if people like that, right? That's a driving force for some people. So that's a good thing. And this is the sort of stuff that on the locals level kind of keeps people who've been playing for like 3, 6, couple years, keeps them, sort of keeps them on the hook, keeps giving them different things to try that are interesting to them without necessarily changing the characters. They can still mix it up if they want to. And the other thing it does, from sort of a cold-hearted sales standpoint, is it makes your collection kind of sprawl out a bit. If you get all the stuff to build a chaos deck right now, you're gonna end up with a set of walk the dogs. And now, once you have those walk the dogs, now it's like, well, now I could build an air or an order deck. I already have the walk the dogs, right? And now you're encouraged to go get the air cards that you're missing, the order cards, and your collection kind of naturally spreads out from that. And that has a positive impact on the secondary market. And just generally, you're keeping people going after cards, wanting more cards, getting some product, that sort of thing. So that is a good thing, and it doesn't not exist in Attuned World, but it's certainly not the same dynamic. On the flip side, the Attuned World pros, and specifically I'm going to reference, let's say we go to 8 symbols instead of 6, because this isn't really 2 of 6 symbols, but if you had 8 symbols instead of having 12 card pools, right, instead of just having air, just having all, just having the fire pool, you would have 28 card pools, 28 different pairs of symbols. So you would have a little bit less of, well, why did you build life such and such when life overhaul is just better, right? Because right now, the way it happens is, aside from some like very specific themed characters, usually what it boils down to is on any given symbol, there's maybe 2 or 3 characters that are considered the good ones for that symbol, and the rest of the characters don't really feel like they matter. Like, you could build them, but somebody's going to tell them your deck's better off as someone else. And so that kind of restricts the character pool in terms of things you might think about remotely competitively. Well, if you have, instead of 12 card pools, you have 28 card pools. Now you amplify that, right? You have more characters that could have some justification for playing them, just on the basis of what cards they have access to. And I think that would be a good thing. The next thing, and probably actually the biggest thing from my perspective, is just the sorting and deck building quality of life. You would be able to just take your cards and sort them by symbol, and put the air cards in one row, and the order cards in another row, and the fire cards in another row, and that's it. And then when you're building a deck, if you want to build an air fire deck, you could look through your air cards and then look through your fire cards. And this sounds like a silly nitpick, but this stuff kind of matters, right? We have heard like stories from a few different places of people that are just buying challenger decks and playing challenger precons at their kitchen table, and the reason they don't try to expand beyond that is because deck building is weird, right? If you have a couple challenger decks and you want to figure out what decks you might be able to make by mixing them together, it's this whole process where you have to like pick a symbol on one of the characters and then rummage through each of your other decks, sorting out like, okay, where are all the chaos cards, and then in order to compare that to what earth cards you have, now you have to desort, because some of those chaos cards are going to have earth, or you're going to make multiple piles of here's my chaos cards, here's my chaos and earth, here's my earth cards, and you have to do this. And it's quite a feat compared to, if all these challenger decks were just, in a Toon world, you'd have your chaos water challenger deck and your fire death challenger deck, and say like, well, I can make a chaos death deck if I have this chaos death character. Here's my chaos dark cards, here's my death cards. I can put them in completely separate piles for my fire and water cards and just figure out what I want to do. Imagine building a deck out of a booster box or out of 2 booster boxes, which is something a lot of new players to card games might decide to do. Trying to do that in the old world is kind of a pain in the neck, and trying to do that in a Toon world would be pretty easy, all things considered. So I think that quality of life is pretty valuable, especially in the early stages, maybe in the stages before the talent tree stuff would take hold for, on the other side of the docket. But yeah, I think that's actually really valuable and a good thing to want. You also get draft legibility if you can manage to make a draft format that functions, that people want to play. You get a lot more sensible signaling. If you pick up a pack and it has, you death, fire, and air cards, then you say, okay, well, these symbols must be open, as opposed to when everything has 3 symbols, it's really hard to get that sort of read on stuff. So it would make the practice of trying to draft, if you had a draft format where symbols matter that worked, which we'll get to that, it would be it's a lot more viable when you have 1 symbol per card. Also makes it easier to balance out symbol count. You can make all your themed cards, all your little mini kits. You can give this character 7 cards, this character gets 5, this one gets 13, this one gets 2, and look at what all the symbols are and be like, all right, we need this many of this symbol, this many of this many of this, and you just make the back page and you're done. Or, and you don't have to be perfectly balanced, obviously, but if you wanted to be, it would be very easy and straightforward to do. And that's more of a design quality of life thing, but, when this is really hard to do and you're still trying to do the kinds of just partial variable size character hits that I'm advising for, if we still had the old world, you just wouldn't have that much symbol, wouldn't have that balance between symbols within a set, which, not the end of the world, but it's a nice thing to be able to just fix symbol balance by fixing symbol balance and not having to do this whole convoluted math thing. And lastly, of course, is the ability to pursue robust symbol identities, which I don't think they're really doing right now. That's certainly a criticism I have of them, is that, I don't know how valuable symbol identities are in general in this game. I think the job that colors and factions and stuff do in other games are relatively well handled in this game by character themes, if you sort of think about what the purposes of these different things are. But some people disagree, and it is nice. You get questions that are like, hey, what does this symbol do? What is this symbol about? That sort of thing. And it's nice to be able to answer those, right? So to the extent that they do have some value, I think they could do a much better job than what they're doing right now. All right, so we'll get to... Oh, we're skipping some slides here. So that'll come a little bit later. We'll talk about draft first. So, like I said, go to 8 symbols. We take the 6 that we have in AOT, add earth and water. This means getting rid of all void, as well as good and evil. Void's the only one of those 4 that I feel any remorse about. The other 3 can go, I don't care. But it is, you have 8, you have 2, and you could do a system where you have 9 and 3, and then you'd have to come up with a different draft system for it. But for the purposes of this deck, we're going to assume we have 8 symbols and we're going 2 per character. Then you could make sure 28 is just sane enough of a number that you could force that to be every pair shows up in a set. Right, you have a separate pool of character cards. If there's not that many characters in the IP, you can start having 2 versions of characters in the set. That's fine. They've done that before. It's not the end of the world. It gives more chances for your high popular characters to have a viable version, right? So you have 28 different characters in a set, and since they're not all forced to have 9 cards each, so it doesn't mean your sets are gigantic. As long as they average like 5, 6, 7 cards, you'll have a reasonably sized set. And like I say, you can just fix the symbol count on the backspace. But the important thing is that all 28 pairs are present in the set. And then you do the thing where the store has, a few of each, and you have the store supply of characters, and you'll pick the characters afterwards. And the reason why you would definitely have to pick the characters afterwards is because I would propose you do a conquest draft, which is instead of drafting 2 symbols out of the 8 symbols available, you would draft 4 symbols, or up to 4. You can use 3 if you want, but you draft up to 4 symbols, and your deck can use half of the symbols available, and you can figure out which 4 of those are over the course of the draft, just sort of freely. You'll probably be focusing on 3 and pick up a 4th as you go. And so you have this 4-symbol draft deck, and then you go to your character pile and you pick 2 characters that cover those 4 symbols. So that means you'll have 3 different pairings, right? If you have air, fire, earth, and water, you could have the air, fire character and the earth, water character, or the air, earth, and the fire, water, or the air, water, and the fire, earth. And so you pick one of those pairings, and now you have a deck, and you have 2 characters that cover the symbols in the deck, and then you play what's called the conquest format, which is you play a best of 3, and you have to win with each character once. So both players will shuffle up, you'll play the game, whoever wins has to swap characters, whoever loses can keep theirs or swap, but at the end of the day, they'll have to win with both characters, and whoever wins 2 first wins the match. And so this would be, first of all, it would allow draft to function despite, 1 symbol per card and 8 different symbols, because any sort of combination of 4 symbols you might do would by definition have half the card pool to have access to. And second of all, it'd be a neat little wrinkle to make drafts feel a little bit different from constructed, and it would get a little bit away from, if there's a character that's sort of a quote-unquote draft monster, at least you only have to play 1 game against it, right? If you get blown out by some draft format's equivalent of Younger Toguro, they still have to win the other game, right? So it would make the feels bads a little bit less feels bad in that regard. And so I think this would be an interesting idea. You still need to do something about the pack math. I think ultimately, so long as drafts are 6 packs, people aren't going to want to draft. So you'd still need to improve cards per pack and work on stuff like that. But this is an example of a way that you could make draft work despite having 2 symbols per character and 1 on each card. You can also do, just really simple cheat. You could do draft now with symbol picking and just say, draft 3 symbols and your character has to have 2 of them is something you'd be allowed to do right now. For instance, like, you can get creative. There's no reason why you have to be super dogmatic about the way your symbol matching is set up, just so long as symbols matter while you're drafting, so you're not just... Your best card drafting isn't very interesting, right? People would rather just play sealed than do that. Alright, now, as for symbol identities, what they're doing right now is basically on the level of, like, a symbol has 1 or 2 things that it does, right? Chaos does momentum things and has some random effects. Air clears card pools and I guess seems to like counting its attacks. Order does freeze stuff and I guess picks up foundations and has wall counters. And this isn't really doing anything useful, right? In terms of symbol identities, right? There's no power level implication here. It's just each symbol has some like thing that it does, and that's kind of just it. And it's really no better. Like, we had this before, right? Even in the old world with 3 symbols in every card, everybody knew that chaos was the momentum symbol. Everyone knew that fire liked to self-mill. Everyone knew that, well, air and then later water were the symbols that like to ready foundations. So if your symbol identities are going to be that simple, you aren't really getting that out of going down to 1 symbol per card, because you had that before. You can do symbol identities that are just that level of literally identification more so than anything that has any real game impact. Could already be done just with the system that you had before. So if you're going to pursue symbol identities, you really want them to be more meaningful than that. And so each symbol should have a whole layout, right? What does this symbol do well? What does it do poorly? What is it just not allowed to do? What are the things that only this symbol does? Maybe each symbol has different ways that it accesses card draw or card advantage or sees new cards. Different symbols can be better or worse at different keywords. They have different forms of board interaction. They could even have, special features like maybe this is the symbol that gets the 6-check foundations, or maybe this symbol gets an extra speed on all of its moves. And so you could really make this whole sheet for each symbol, and you'd have to figure out exactly how deep and specific you want to get, because at some point these become restrictions. But you'd map that out for each symbol, and then you could use that to you adhere to those. And if you stick to those, then you'll develop symbol identities that are deeper than just chaos does momentum. Right? I mean, chaos does momentum, and chaos is you also has the biggest check boost, and Chaos is one of the better stun symbols, and Chaos, likes to have cheap attack block mods on its attacks or something like that. And I'll have an example sheet here, but the important thing is you want to follow these, but you don't want these to drive your design. Right? You don't want to be like, I need to make a character. Okay, what do its symbols do? Okay, this tells me what the character does, because then you're going to miss a lot of stuff. Right? Sasha's one difficulty theme is not a symbol thing. And this is why character themes are good, because there's all sorts of possible stuff you can do that are never going to be assigned to a symbol. Right? It's never going to be a part of a symbol's identity, it's never going to be mid-attacks. But Kendo has a mid-attack theme, and if everything we were doing was driven by symbol identities, you'd never have a mid-attack theme. That wouldn't be allowed, because there's no symbol mechanical tie-in to that. Right? So you still have your character themes, you still want to come up with different and creative things outside of just what's on the symbol sheet, but you want to try to, not violate the symbol sheet, or, as you go on, you might have to tweak how they're laid out. In practice, you'd probably, tune these things over time. But by way of example, let's say water. Let's say we have a sheet that's like, all right, water's, each symbol is going to have 2 keywords that it really likes. And so water really likes deflect and combo. That doesn't mean water and the other symbol are the only ones that get those keywords necessarily, but they'll get the best ones. If there's any sort of deflect themed card, it would either have water or, let's say, death on it or something like that. But those are sort of the keywords that it likes. And it can still do the other keywords too. Just it might not have the best stun attack in the format, would not be a water attack. Card access. Let's say when water wants to get more cards, it just gets to draw cards, right? Maybe 4 symbols draw cards and 4 symbols get filters, for instance. And maybe that distinction is not actually worth making, but let's say we're making that here. Let's say each symbol has different ways that it likes to interact with its opponent's pieces. Let's say water seals stuff. Other symbols might commit things, other symbols might destroy things, flip things, but when water wants to touch something, it seals it. And let's say water's special, distinct statistical features, it gets nice 3-diff attacks, right? It gets more 3-diff attacks and better ones than the other symbols get. The other symbols maybe get some of your standard prototypical kind of lame 3-diff attacks that we've seen a lot of, but water gets the cool ones, right? Maybe that's something that water gets to do. And then very specifically, maybe water's the only symbol that adds cards to card pools, maybe water's the only symbol that picks up cards from card pools. And just as a flavor thing, the same way fire likes to mill itself, maybe water likes to flip its foundations. Right, just by way of example, you wouldn't necessarily do exactly this. You wouldn't necessarily have all of these categories. Maybe you'd have more categories. Maybe you'd have some more fine-tuning, right? But this is the kind of thing I'm talking about. Like, your symbol identity should look something like this, rather than just, well, air clears its card pool, and that's what air does. Period, end of story. That's not really... Like, it's better than doing nothing, but you're not really getting... Like, when you put one symbol on card, you can do a lot more with it than what they're doing now. And so if they're going to take that route, I'd like them to take full advantage of it. Right, you could even go so far as to have probably at most 1 symbol each. That's just, this symbol is very bad at playing defense. So let's say fire is just terrible at playing defense. Then whenever you build a deck with a fire earth character or whatever, then any defense you want is going to have to come from the earth cards. But it's a cool, funny flavor wrinkle that fire sucks at defense. And you can make, I don't know, order suck at offense or something like that. It is something that you could do. So you can do stuff like that if you set up the plan and you put in the effort and you've organized it and you think about, you can compare the identities side by side and decide, is this mechanic profile balanced against this one, that sort of thing. All right, next up, mechanics and keywords. Some water. All right. So this is going to be, I believe, just sort of a hodgepodge of bullet points. First of all, as referenced earlier, I would just get rid of assets. I would get rid of actions. I think assets they're not different enough from foundations to really be worth having as a card type. Foundation, but it doesn't commit to past checks. Like, from just a big picture macro game design perspective, why even bother? Anything that's an asset now could be a foundation and just let it commit to past checks, and maybe that means those effects have to be not quite as strong or whatever. Who cares? So that's fine. I don't think assets really carry their weight as a card type, but there's not really any reason to have them exist. So you could, if you want to have a third card type besides attacks and foundations, you could come up, either keep doing backups or come up with a new card type to fill that void. Same thing, I'd remove actions. This is more of a complexity play, right? The way that actions work, and you play the ability on the card in your hand, and you play the card in your card pool, but you only play one of the abilities on the card, and we've already started to do some sort of from hand abilities. We do deflect now. We have abilities that you just play out of their hand. I would just transition to that. I would just take anything that I might want to make an action card. You can just make a from hand ability on a foundation. You make some interesting foundations where their only abilities are something you play from their hand, and then they always have the backup mode of you can play them, right, and just have them as a blank foundation. But this way your quote unquote action cards are all like the old Revoke, so to say. One of the reasons Revoke saw infinite play was because it had this backup mode of just being a foundation. And people were happy to take the blank foundation for the payoff of having, this cool action card in their deck. And I think that can just be the norm, right? Any sort of hand trappy type abilities you want to put, you could put on foundations or attacks for that matter. And just have those be cards that are, kind of blank and dead, but you might, they're sort of your pseudo actions. And the foundation attack side is sort of their backup mode. And I think that's a perfectly fine and viable dynamic. It's relatively simple. You can put costs on your from hand abilities. There's nothing saying you can't. And what benefit you get out of having this make the check, put it in your pool in order to play the enhance, I don't think is really worth it. A lot of these actions end up removing themselves or not counting to progressive or whatever anyway. It's never really made that much sense as a design, so I'd just scrap it and just do more from hand abilities. More Spirit Lollipops. I think that'd be perfectly fine. I would get rid of, I mentioned Shift earlier, I would get rid of Terrain. I think Terrain's well, we'd be getting rid of assets anyway, but Terrain's a terrible keyword. It's not, the original conception of it made some sense, but it's just become this weird force thing where cards have these really minor two-sided abilities just so that you can put the word terrain on them, and it has to be a terrain because it's a location, ha ha ha, and it doesn't really work these days. It was a good, when the first terrains were these really crazy, both players can review any number of cards kinds of things where they really changed the game dramatically for both players, and that was what the card did. Then it made a little bit more sense as sort of a global, we're changing what location we're in type of thing, but that's kind of degraded to the point where it's not really worth keeping around. Flash, just, if we're going to move to a more, response speeds, style of attack abilities, more responses on play and more responses on hit, then Flash makes less and less sense. I don't feel too strongly about this. You could keep it and frame it as an offense ability where, if you give a card Flash, you're expecting that to be a benefit. You're almost assuming that the person using the Flash attack is going to find ways to circumvent, not having the enhanced step, and maybe the defender won't be able to as much. So you could have it around as sort of an offense-based keyword, but it gets used so little that, I think you might as well just let it fade out. And places where you would use Flash, you can just spell it has no enhanced step. Obviously, you could keep saying gains Flash and have it show up, once every other set and have people ask what it is. Either way. I would also either stop doing face-up momentum or at least make it very rare. I think we went a little bit hog wild with this, and we started having characters with whole face-up momentum themes, and now they have an entire stage inside their momentum, and now we're unflipping momentum. And that is just not good for the complexity creep, right? That's not good for the mental load. Watching a new player play against Amajiki is a very painful experience, having had to see that multiple times. Yeah, it's a nice idea. I think there's some cute designs you can make where an attack has a little nifty from momentum ability, but not good to overkill it. Maybe slide it in once in a while, or just don't do it at all, right? Either way. I think it's good space, but I don't like the complexity burden when you have more than one face-up momentum starts to get really bad, right? I think if you have just one, it's kind of okay, but once people have 4 face-up momentum, it's a mess. Also, I would just avoid changing block modifiers, and I think we're doing less of this now anyway, so this is probably already underway, but don't tell people their block modifier to block this attack gets +1, your block modifier. Blocking math is sort of weird and convoluted enough as it is for most newer players that we're telling you, oh, by the way, your block mod gets +2. Just, it's not worth it for things that are just glorified modifications of speed. Just don't do it. I can buy into maybe making a block mod 0 effects. Maybe those are okay. But other than that, I just wouldn't mess with block mods. I don't think we're really worth it. Some other keyword notes. I would upgrade combo. I think you could just get rid of the direct preceding requirement. I get that it's flavorful, but functionally, combo having to worry about what if the opponent makes me, put something in my pool, makes me play something else, has always kind of dragged it back. And we end up making like combo attack because having narrow combo requirements is too, it's too difficult. And so I think if combo has clear quality of life problems, we might as well just fix the keyword to give it more quality of life to maybe let that help. So let's just say, combo punch means you just need to have another punch somewhere in your card pool. And, if you want to play one punch and then play, 3 kicks that all have combo punch, Godspeed. Right? That should just be fine rather than having to put combo attack on things just because we can't make combo work otherwise. And, some things would get like a little bit better with this, but it's fine. Yeah, I don't think that's too much of an issue. I just give combo some QOL. Throw, I would just replace throw. I think it's pretty consistently, anytime we have to put your non-throw attack on something, anytime we argue about whether we should or not, anytime we have to worry about does this mono throw deck exist, and just the fact that it's a keyword ability that is gated to the flavor of the move, right? If somebody is picking somebody up and tossing them in a game, then we feel like we have to make it a throw, and we feel like those are the only cards we're allowed to make throws, and that's really weird. So I still don't think throw's a great keyword all around. So I would just replace it with a rated keyword that sort of caps and makes the throw deal exactly that much damage when it's fully blocked, or change it to a health loss thing. You can do it either way. There's cases, there's a case to be made for one way or the other to doing it. Either response when fully blocked, your rival loses X health, or response when fully blocked, this attack still deals X damage, make it like Electric Jolt. You can do that either way, but I would just change throw to a more generically named rated keyword. So you could put it where you want it, where it makes sense, instead of feeling required to put it on exactly these types of moves in certain IPs. Mega Man was really weird because we weren't allowed to make any throws because there were no throws in the IP. It was all range moves. And so it's never been great in that regard. And this way, depending on how you make it, you get to not have to put your non-blank attack on a bunch of stuff, and it saves you some card text and all that. Deadlock. So I think at this point you'd have to ban some cards to make this okay, but I think Deadlock should be forcible. I think for what it is, especially with the kinds of cards that they're making, they've made a bunch of these, blank 4/3s and blank 1/5 foundations that have nothing but Deadlock abilities on them. And I think those can be a good idea, but only if Deadlock is something where you can make sure that the game goes to Deadlock in some way that's relatively healthy. So there's a few ways you can do this. I think probably the one that makes the most sense is to, instead of counting how many foundations are on either stage, you count the total number of foundations. And let's say if at the start of the turn there's more than 20 foundations out, then Deadlock's active this turn. Right, so you don't have like people building mid-turn to go into Deadlock and then backing out of it so their opponent's not in or any of that. Right, you'd have to refine it in some way, but I think doing that has some benefits. Again, you'd have to get rid of the stuff that would be really busted if you do this. You wouldn't be able to have Ore Strike in the format. But I think as another avenue for decks to have late game win con type options. Right, it would provide a way, the way most Deadlock effects are, this would provide a way for decks to win games late with attack turns that look kind of normal, just with maybe better numbers or a little bit of looping going on. And I think that's good, right? Anytime your long game decks are winning by playing relatively normal shaped attack strings, that's a lot better than your long game decks winning by just gradually throwing someone to death, or by milling them out, or by crafting their unblockable 40 speed for 40 with 5 pieces of negation backing it up. It's much healthier if decks in the later stages of the game are still playing this like, I'm going to try to win with an attack string game, because then it behooves them to engage with you're trying to poke and deal damage earlier on to make that late game win easier. So I think that's a very good ideal to pursue, is to have even your quote unquote control deck still playing relatively normal shaped games in terms of winning. But you would on the flip side, right, because players would be able to force this, not only would you have to ban the Ore Strikes, you also want to try to make sure that your Deadlock cards are very intentional, intentionally made not to... You wouldn't put some crazy deadlocking ability on cards that your bum rush aggro decks are expected to run. Right, you try to do things like put them on cards that are otherwise blank, but make sure they're on cards that you're only putting in your deck if you are expecting or wanting to hedge for those longer games, as opposed to, I don't know, Dragon Strike might be an example, right? You probably wouldn't do a Dragon Strike. You might not have to ban that one in this kind of case, but putting giant deadlock effects on cards that you're expecting your really angry decks to be running wouldn't be something you do. You try to make it expressly a mid to late game deck kind of thing that they would put in to try to set up for those types of games. And again, I think it should stay as a foundation count just because we have so much stuff designed around that, but you could do something around, if there's been 2 total cycles this game or something like that. You could fiddle with the number. Maybe it's better at 25 foundations. I think one of the interesting things about total foundation account is it means there's a cost to getting outbuilt that doesn't really exist right now. Provided, if everybody's trying to abide by deadlock, then if you get outbuilt right now, you still just get to 10 just like they do. Whereas if you get outbuilt and deadlock's about total foundations, if you don't want to go to deadlock and you're down 14-6, then, well, you should have built more earlier, I guess, right? It would make a real cost to that and provide some value to things like foundation destruction in the late game instead of them just being benefits to the opponent. So I think there's some positive knockoff effects about making it a foundation count like that. Obviously, you would want to test the crap out of this, right? But I think it's an interesting idea at this point that if we're going to have a bunch of deadlock abilities in this game, we could probably improve upon the way it works in some way. All right, as for that asset replacement, backup replacement I talked about earlier, again, this is just one of very many possible ideas. This is sort of just an example I had. But let's just say we call them supports for having very boring names, whatever, put a name on the thing. It goes in your stage. Let's say instead of stamina, they have an assist value. Somewhere between 5 and 8, you'd have to work out what you want the number ranges to different difficulties to be. But the big idea here is that this would be a different way of having a card in your stage that helps you pass checks. And specifically, when you go to make a check, you could, instead of making the check, discard your support to get that assist value as your check. So you could check a 7 if you have, a 3 or 4 difficulty support in your stage that has that 7 assist value. And yeah, obviously having a guaranteed, I'm going to check this much in your back pocket is very good and very powerful. So you'd be interested in playing these cards, and they would have ability, their main ability would be something that triggers when you use the assist. So the whole idea is you set this out, it's there for later, it's a one-off, you're going to pop the thing, you're going to get the check, you're going to get effect, and they may never have any other permanent in-stage effect. Maybe they have a really small one. But the main thrust of these cards is that the card type exists to guarantee your checks in exchange for taking time, right? I would never want to make a support that's 1 difficulty or 0 and possibly be dodgy about making ones that are 2. The whole idea is to make these little higher difficulty things that reward you for taking a little bit of a time and not just slamming all the attacks you can onto. If you take a little bit of time, maybe you poke and play your 4 difficulty assist. Now you're going to be better positioned for later in a way that playing one more foundation would not be as impactful as having, a big support assist out there for you to use later. And also, if you make them relatively higher difficulty, then someone can't try to make like a mono support deck. It wouldn't work. So it's just a neat pet idea I thought I had. Just by way of example, you can come up with different card types. There's more ways to do it than just, let's lift an idea from another card game and slam it in here. Although, there are plenty of ideas in other card games that might be useful that you could look at and probably come up with some ideas from, but there's sort of a cute idea I had. All right, next up, terms and templating. Are there ways that we can modify the ways that we're wording cards, what we're putting on cards to make it a little bit easier, for newer players and make the game more accessible and all that? So the one pet idea that I'm really high on is helper icons. And so the idea behind this is next to each ability, or next to each stage ability maybe, you put a little icon. You'd put, let's say, a sword or a shield or something like that, indicating, for the most part, and you could tweak this, but let's say a sword ability means this is an ability you want to play on your turn, and a shield is an ability you want to play on their turn. And maybe you put both if it's either way, or put some sort of like global or 2-player icon or something like that. And that way, someone who's new and hasn't memorized all the cards yet doesn't have to read every card in their stage, every enhance, to try to figure out which ones they can play. They can scan over, say like, okay, it's my turn. I only care about these ones with a little sword icon in them because all these other ones I can see very quickly without actually reading the card, that I don't need to care about them right now. And it just really smooth out those early games when you don't know all the cards yet. And you cut down on the mental load. Right now you can very quickly say like, okay, instead of having to care about 9 cards, I only have to care about 4. And, it goes if we're doing more from hand abilities, you can put a little hand icon next to those. You don't want to have a million different icons because now you have a new memorization challenge, but you could have 3, 4, 5, especially if they're self-explanatory. I would not make these binding. I would not necessarily make the sword next to an ability literally mean it's only playable on your turn, just because, maybe you want to not... You probably still want to put the brackets on those in those cases, and maybe you don't really need it, etc., etc. But just put the icon there if it's something broadly that, like, hey, here's something that you use on your turn, here's something you use on their turn. Just make it quick and easier to scan cards and find out what's going on. Another thing is, I think we could probably template our responses better. I would like to move response triggers outside of the text of the ability. You can just put it in, as part of the ability type, ability cost, that sort of thing, right? But maybe before the cost. So for instance, response dash after you block dash commit, do XYZ. And part of the goal in this is to also, get a lot of shorthands. So you could do response on hit, and on hit could mean when this attack deals damage, for instance. And you could still do that shorthand in the effect that, colon on hit comma, but it kind of makes more sense to have that sort of shorthand in right up front in the ability description. And again, part of this is for scannability. You don't have to read as deep into the ability to figure out if you can use it right now, right? It's right there up front. Everything up front tells you when you can use the ability, and then you get into what it's actually doing. Just so that you can get through cards quicker and more quickly eliminate, okay, I can use this, I can't use that, and get through them and figure things out. And it would make, really long response triggers look really awkward. So you'd have all this junk in the cost, but that's probably a good thing. Maybe we shouldn't have really long and awkward response triggers anyway. But yeah, I think that would be a little bit cleaner. And it's perfectly viable to reshape the rules to make this a valid way to frame responses. You can do the same thing for static triggers, right? You do a stat, like I was talking earlier, you could have a static just say on player, on attack, dash, do XYZ, and that's just a static thing that happens. That's a way you could replace blitz. You called out here. And you could make this during the attack if you really want to, and we can talk about that later. Other random bits and bobs, I think for the most part, if not in all cases, anything that's self-referential, like this card, this character, this attack, you can just say this, right? This gets +4 damage when it's sitting on an attack. It's pretty clear what that's doing. You don't really need to specify the card type there, right? Same thing, ready this foundation could just say ready this, period, and people will know what it means. Just a little bit of card savings that you could do. I'd like to maybe come up with simpler ways to say some of the complex multi-syllable stuff that we have in the game, just for the sake of making things easier to read and parse. Completely and partially blocked can just be fully and half blocked. That's what people say verbally most of the time anyway. We should, like every single other modern card game on the face of the earth, change remove from game into some banish, exile, erase, like whatever you want to call it. But you just make it something other than removed from the game, which that's just really wordy for no reason, as pretty much every single game that uses the RFG has figured out by now, and we haven't. And a progressive difficulty has always been a stickler. I think this is a conversation that's happened a lot. Pick a word. I put down strain here. It could be all sorts of stuff, but if we can explain progressive difficulty to people without having to say progressive difficulty, it's like 8 syllables or something, that just makes it sound really complicated, just because of the words that are being used to describe it. If we could give it some kind of simple name, that would help with teaching a little bit. It would help with, any cards that reference it would become easier to read. If you're familiar with writing methodology, it's generally goes to say that the more one-syllable words you have and the more like simple words and shorter sentences you have, the easier something is to read. And so you don't really want your card text to read like a biology textbook if you can avoid it. And so going after some of the words that contribute to that, and maybe we can't do anything about foundation at this point, but stuff like progressive difficulty, you could probably change that. All right, last bit, let's talk a little bit about rules and little arcane things like that. Just various rules nitpicks. I think I've referenced this a couple times already. You can remove the attack stack at this point. You can come up with some creative way to deal with the retro-related reasons why this exists. And if you don't know what the attack stack is, that's my point. But if you don't have the attack stack and you just deal with multiple and reversal in some means that it's not too important, what the nitty-gritty of that is. Once you don't have the attack stack, you can just say the attack sequence begins when you play the attack, you handle any on-play, etc. triggers, and then you move into the enhanced step. We already have spaces between steps and stuff like that, so it'd be fine for there to be space between playing the attack and starting the enhanced step, and you could say that, the attack sequence begins as soon as the attack is played. That's something is perfectly viable for you to do. You just need to decide what you want your solution to the ancient stuff to be, which there's plenty of creative things you can do there. It's fine. This is, I put this on here, but I built this deck long before the AOT2 previews, and then we got into preview season, so I put this off. But prescient, and hopefully this is happening very, very, very soon, we should get rid of the character commits to play commit when foundation costs. That is a weird rule that a lot of players don't even know about until they lose a game to it. It's just a thing that was there in 2006 for... It was probably even an artifact when the game first released, honestly, because they had a different ways of passing checks back then. Was a different concept. So there's a certain logic to it, but there's not enough logic to it to keep it. There's nothing critical that breaks by not having access to this. It's fine. We're not scared of hurting Nomu anymore. Like, just get rid of it. It's not worth it. This is really technical. I don't think unique should be a keyword ability or terrain if you keep it. There should just be a special type of keyword that's like a rules keyword or something for these. Just because there's a lot of like wacky rules complexity that happens that you suddenly have to start handling when unique can be sealed off of a card. And that's not worth having around. Just have unique not be an ability, and get rid of that. This is really deep in the rules weeds. Another thing I think you can do, and this would take some thought and some consideration, but I think you can get the block sit down into one act. If you're not familiar right now, blocking attack first means you play the card and then some stuff triggers, and then the attack becomes blocked and then some stuff triggers. And that's a bit of a weird dynamic. I think it's weird for new players. Maybe it's not, but I think that's something you could probably make that into one fell swoop when... as soon as you play the card, the attack gets blocked, however it's blocked, and everything shares the same trigger. Maybe that's not worth actually changing, but that's always been kind of a weird technicality that would be nice to get rid of. Also, we should have some form of starter rules that aren't a video. I appreciate the video, and I'm sure the demo is great. The physical demos are great. The video walkthrough, what's it called, Dized demo is great, but if somebody wants to just like sit down and try to read how to play the game, they should be able to do that without having to break out their phone and sit through a video. Some people prefer that format. And I know the 2-player rules booklet in the original MHA ones didn't go over too well, but you can improve upon that. You can certainly do that better, especially if you're cleaning up some of the other rules and complexity and you have a certain level of simplicity in your starter decks. I think there should be some sort of physical learn the game piece of paper or something. All right, final slide, just overall big picture. We probably need a new high quality rules document at this point. The MHA document was made in response to some feelings that the LGR was too technical, and that's not entirely incorrect, but the MHA style rulebook isn't really technical enough, and it's a bit of a mess to maintain. And so we could really use a new, probably 2 different rulebooks, probably one that's a really technical, this is the final say rulebook, and one that's kind of the like plain English document that doesn't, but because it's not the final say rulebook, it doesn't have to have every last detail crammed into it somewhere, right? It can just kind of read in some smooth fashion. That's probably not glossary either, right? The current rulebook's basically a glossary, and you have to figure out what term to look up to find whatever rule you're looking for. I think it generally works better if you can read through, like, okay, here are the phases of the game, here are the details about those phases, okay, here's the process of playing a card, here's the details about that, and so on. And my main thing with this is I don't want to get too into, I'm not too attached to, oh, this rule should work specifically this way, oh, that rule should work specifically that way, oh, I think my intuition says that such and such should be XYZ. People make a lot of those arguments, and it turns out that different peoples have different people think different things are so-called intuitive for different reasons. And I think what I want to see from a rules rework is just that it has, one or two consistent guiding principles up front, and it sticks to that. And what I mean is, let's say, here's 5 examples, maybe there's other ones, but you could say, we really care about making things historically intuitive. We really want to prioritize making sure things work as close to the way they've always worked as we can make it. And, that's going to be our top priority. Or your top priority, or a very high priority, could be cross-game intuition. We want people coming from these other games to feel like the rules in this game are familiar to them, because stuff in this game works similarly to the way that these other targeted games work. Or you could say that your priority is non-gamer intuition, right? There are things that people who play card games find intuitive because of just the way card games work, that someone who's just, a random Turtle fan coming in might not be part of their intuition. To say, all right, we really want people who are going to read these cards and expect them to seem like English, we want the English reading of cards to be as close to what they actually do as possible. You could also have a programmer's intuition, which is a little weird to explain, and I don't even have a firm definition of this, but it's things like don't repeat yourself, try to make sure that as much as you can, you're having reusable sections of the book. So for instance, in the original LGR, that was the original, like 2013 to 2020 rulebook that we used. The process of playing a card, an ability, and the action were all the same sequence, with some slight conditionals for, like, well, if you're playing an action, do this thing instead. But they all use the same section of the rulebook for those 3 different processes. And that's a programmer type of thing, where you're trying to have these reusable modules so that it sort of forces some consistency, but it also makes a little bit cleaner to maintain. There's a little bit less that people need to learn in theory. But it can be a little bit weird if you're not familiar with that way of building things to bounce around and know what's happening. I've seen a recent rulebook for another game that's kind of gotten out of hand with this, I think. They've sort of abstracted everything out so far that it's using a bunch of ideas that are nowhere near on any of the actual cards. But that is a valid way you could build a rulebook, is to say that that's your top priority. And then there's also ideas about internal consistency, or how important is it that 2 things that look similar work similar. And that can clash with these different types of intuitions, right? For instance, right now, rules about destroying face downs and getting triggers, depending how different cards move to different zones, are not terribly consistent with each other at all. And that might be there to match some cross-game intuition, for instance, or it might be there to match some other type of intuition you might have. It's doing it at the cost of internal consistency. And so my point is that all these different ways of looking at things conflict with each other, and depending on which one you're favoring, you could come to different answers. And I don't have too much of a preference for which thing they want to pick here, but I think they should just pick, like, this is our top priority, this is our second priority, and these are going to be the guiding principles for our rules, and that's what we're going to do. And if somebody doesn't like it, at least they can understand and respect that this is why we're doing the rules the way that we're doing. As opposed to right now, it's kind of just a hodgepodge where at any given time, depending on who initiated what change, it could be made for any given reason. And so, in some cases, the rules are trying really hard to be internally consistent. In other cases, they're trying really hard to be plain English. In other cases, and that's part of what makes the rules feel like a bit of a mess right now. So as part of a rules rebook, the first step is sort of deciding what their guiding principles are going to be, and then they should go with that. And that, I believe, is I did not make an ending slide. That is fine. Yeah, so that's the spiel. I haven't looked at the clock as to how long this took, but hopefully people found it interesting. Thank you for sticking it out this long if you did. Let me know what you think. Make fun of any of my ideas that you think are bad. Defend anything I hate and tell me why you like it. All sorts of fun stuff to have in the comments, or ping me into Discord and give me crap about it. It's all fine. But yeah, hopefully people enjoyed this, found it interesting. You got some things to think about. And let's see. I always like to talk about what my next video is going to be. I frankly have no idea right now. Maybe something AOT2 related. We'll see how it goes. We'll think about some stuff. But yeah, thanks for watching. Take care, and I'll see you next time.